So thinking some, as we just ended the last little mini lecture in the series, about these different process features and object features that make something more like or less successful, takes us to the point where we need to think about how we explain different outcomes of we can think about both how we think these different we're going to be thinking a lot about how we explain how some types of conditions and some sorts of proposed conditions are going to lead to different types of outcomes, successful, unsuccessful, etc. But you can think about these as basically whether these are features of the object, of the process, of the realization process. So again, the general form of an answer, back to our input-output, is there are going to be these features, either of the design or the process itself, the object design or the process design, of an establishment, enterprise, or transition, that lead to some sort of outcome conditions. Now, usually one would think, because we're dealing with individual level behavior, we're thinking about sort of organizational level features, and we want to think about how these affect individual level behavior to lead to sort of organizational level outcomes. This is a version, in essence, of a micro-macro problem. So what we need is some way to think about individual level behavior. Now, the problem is a lot of these features don't necessarily translate into traditional cost-benefit type reasoning. So instead, we're going to be thinking a lot in this course about more realistic models of how humans make decisions. Because we're going to be thinking about basically how people make sense of situations such that they then do the thing that makes sense to them in the situation. They basically have to interpret what type of decision is this and make a decision. And then we're going to be using some behavioral decision-making principles to understand how, once they have made sense of a situation, what is exactly it is that they do. So behavioral decision-making may or may not be familiar to all of you, but I'm going to try to give you a taste, at least, of what some of these behavioral decision-making principles would be that people might use as a general form of an answer of how it is that these various conditions that we're interested in lead to a set of outcome conditions. So for those of you not completely familiar with the idea of behavioral decision-making, this is an area of research started within sort of psychology and cognitive psychology, but it's spreading to social psychology, to behavioral economics, to political psychology, in which we think about basically cognition. So the big breakdown here is the idea that some things are going to be automatic, almost instantaneous or effortless. So if you have practiced things over and over again, if you have learned a certain way of behaving, you don't have to think a lot about whether you do it. You can do it by instinct. So think about an athlete that's very well trained. Think about driving home, and one day you're supposed to be driving to the store, and all of a sudden you go in the wrong direction because you have sort of a learned path of behavior. One of the things that we might think about when we think back on the White case is the idea that the men didn't listen to their boss in part because they hadn't learned to listen to him over a period of time, right? So they have someone who's ostensibly in charge, but they didn't have an automatic response to his authority. If you've listened to someone, for example, in the military, for time after time after time, then when that person barks an order at you in battle, you just obey. You don't have to think a lot about it. Now, not everyone is going to, but that would be a more automatic decision in essence. Now, one thing about automatic cognition is it's not necessarily rational. In fact, it may even lead us into conflict with our conscious goals. So there's a well-known association where there's problems where people want to act in a non-racist or non-sexist manner, yet they have these automatic associations that still basically cause them to be racist and sexist. You know, women can in some ways treat other women just as badly as men because of these learned associations. The same types of things can even happen with minorities. So that's sort of the nature of automatic cognition. And there might be times when we want to think about what are the types of sort of patterns of behavior that have gotten instilled in people that make them automatically feel a certain way and react a certain way. So that type of logic, for example, might lie behind the idea that the managers were so used in Michigan, were so used to having their authority undermined that it was second nature for them not to take that authority unto themselves. They had not been given an opportunity to feel like they actually were in control of their outcomes. Now, controlled cognition and the answers associated with that are different because this is the type of cognition that takes time. It's effortful. We have a limited amount of it, though people at least claim it's somewhat like a muscle. This type of cognition is what you might think of as like traditional rationality, or at the very least, traditional a socially rational behavior. So you might think about impression management goals, like when you're really trying to control how you appear to other people, not behaving in this very more spontaneous manner or learned manner. So control cognition has the ability to be forward-looking, and also mathematical rationality seems to be tied up in controlled cognition. So in other words, there are times whenever we have to think about, in essence, when we're thinking about how people make decisions, they aren't always going to do the rational thing. Sometimes they're going to do this automatic things. Other times we might see that overridden with this more rational thing. And we also might want to think that sometimes what people will do is, in essence, some people might behave in rational ways, and other people might just try to do what people around them do, right? Because that's one of these automatic rules. So again, this is a very different approach, and hopefully, while this isn't a complete introduction, you have some idea now of what I'm talking about when I talk about this behavioral decision-making paradigm. The most important thing that's important to really know for this course is the idea that, in essence, we can think about a 2x2 table to how organizational employees are going to tend to make decisions when they're under threat. So think about any type of change of any sort, and certain types of even organizational conditions might present some series of threat. And so the 2x2 table basically says, how threatening is this thing out there, and how powerful do I perceive myself to be? So it's a little bit tricky when you're talking about individual decision making, because some people who are not in powerful positions may still feel themselves to be powerful. Other people who are in powerful positions may act as if they actually were not powerful. People who are actually under threat may act in a different way, etc. But for now, we're going to assume on average people act about the way you might think they're going to act. And we have some ability to analyze whether a change or a set of conditions are going to be perceived as either low or high in threat, or low, and whether or not the people who have to behave in certain ways are perceive themselves as either low power and ability or high power and ability. So, in essence, thinking about each of these four quadrants, when a person doesn't feel like they're that threatened, but they don't see themselves as low power and low ability, they tend to wait and see what other people do and then comply only if they're being actively monitored if other people around them are doing it. If they're perceived as higher in ability and they see either a very low threat or even an opportunity, they're going to tend to move first, be the first one to sort of engage in this proposed change of behavior, and maybe even extend beyond the bounds of authority. So if you have come up with a lot of suggestions of things that later you sort of realize are probably beyond the boundaries of your organizational authority, then recognize that you might be someone who tends to not see opportunity sometimes instead of threat, right? So it's a good thing to even know about yourself. But it's also good to know that in general, people in lower ranking positions, or people say who dotted line positions, etc., are going to be more likely to see threat than opportunity, given the fact that they don't have a lot of authority. Now, the next question then becomes, what happens whenever people perceive something as high threat? So if they perceive themselves as low power and low ability, they tend to just freeze up, do nothing. This is exactly what we see in Michigan, right? All of the lower level managers who don't perceive themselves as having a lot of power, they perceive this change as high threat because basically their managers are saying one thing and then doing another. They're going to freeze up and just do nothing. Sorry, and then they'll get yelled at for, being resistant to change. However, if what you have instead is managers, in this case we had the assistant and associate director even, who perceive themselves as high power and ability in the situation, and also the proposed budget change is high threat, they ended up involving in engaging in interference, right? So reassigning the managers to other houses and other types of more active interference. Backlash would have actually been outright fights, which we see a little bit of, but usually there wasn't outright fighting against the proposed budgeting change. That tended to be kept more at the level of interference. So when we think about then explaining why in general a policy might fail or succeed, or why a proposed object design might fail or succeed, what you need to think about is basically who is involved and what's impacting their decision to initiate, implement, or comply with change. So you're going to want to think, do they see it as a high threat? Do they see it as a low threat? Like, threat might mean giving them less power, less money, less resources, less status, which you can often use organization establishment enterprise conditions to identify what will actually change their power or resource allocations. And then you also have to think about how powerful they see themselves to be, and whether or not people expect or believe certain things of each other. So part of that could be that during, especially when you have outsiders for whom people don't have well-established expectations, they might have to act in a certain way in order to authorize themselves. We're going to see that in later cases. It becomes quite important for new people to act in a way that authorizes, that shows that they're authorized by others, et cetera, to have power to basically implement and monitor change. And we can think about how other types of institutions might constrain choice or shape patterns of interaction. So all of these types of sort of looser explanations that don't always seem like they're completely rational, when you start getting down to this behavioral framework of thinking about, well, how it affects people's sense of threat and how does it affect their sense of power within the relationship, you can start to see more how it can then predict behavior in ways, this micro-level behavior that can then predict these macro-level outcomes. So what types of interventions then might actually affect the possibility of change? Basically, any design feature that is going to increase opportunity or decrease that threat. And also, in general, things, system alignment. So in essence, when you have, for example, the way that work processes are set up sort of reinforces the status quo of the formal establishment tradition, that's going to be well aligned. If, on the other hand, you have things like gray space and other areas where there's not a well-aligned system, you're going to tend to have, these are going to tend to make change more likely, and it'll even threaten the status quo. The process features are going to be different types of activity. So these are going to be things that happen during the episode. So interference, as we saw in the case of Michigan, any type of more active monitoring. So if we see cases where people are actually sort of calling up these lower level managers and saying, hey, are you doing this? Or in essence, giving them an implicit signal, no, you shouldn't be doing this because you need to tell me and not just figure it out at the house level. That's going to happen. In the case of small wins, what might have thought in the Michigan case that having at least one house actually successfully complete a budget could have cascaded and affected other words. But instead what we saw was that Pearl was heavily criticized. We sort of saw the opposite of a small win. So instead of having one successful episode and other people are like, oh, this isn't so bad, I'm going to do it too, we saw Pearl being really criticized for it, and therefore no other houses wanted to try to follow in that path. Active certification is the ways in which authors can, in essence, self-authorize, and also commitment. So I'm going to be talking more about these mechanisms, but these are basically these underlying types of mechanisms or features that that can help us explain why certain interventions can actually affect